This is Tommy's Outdoors episode 20, and it is a landmark episode. Why? Well, because I read somewhere not long ago that most of the new podcasts never make it to episode 20. Well, we just made it to episode 20. And so I would like to thank all the listeners for being with us for 20 episodes, and all our followers on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. And I hope you're going to continue to enjoy the podcast. And I'm working hard to bring you the best in the outdoors podcasting. So that's the first thing. Secondly, it is no secret that one of the missions of the Tommy's Outdoors podcast is to talk about wildlife conservation, habitat protection, and all the issues related to protecting Mother Nature. And our guest today is Pádraic Fogarty, the campaign officer at Irish Wildlife Trust. He's also an ex-editor of Irish Wildlife magazine and author of the book Whittled Away, Ireland's Vanishing Nature. You can get that book on Amazon or on Irish Wildlife Trust website. So I was very happy that Pádraic kindly accepted my invitation to the podcast. And not only did he accept the invitation, he extended that invitation to me and invited me to his house. So we recorded the podcast in his house, and essentially we just hang out together for most of the day. We ate dinner together, and we had plenty of opportunity to talk about conservation and various issues related to wildlife. So the podcast is very interesting, and we're really covering a lot of ground. We're talking about deer management, we're talking about shark handling, we talk about badger culling, and many other issues related to wildlife. So this is I think very good episode with a lot of important information. And please support the Irish Wildlife Trust. I became a member of the Irish Wildlife Trust after recording that episode. It's only a couple of bucks, and I think that these guys are doing really good job, and they're really doing it professionally, and they know how to approach various issues. So please support Irish Wildlife Trust. And other than that, ladies and gentlemen, Pádraic Fogarty. Welcome to the show, Pádraic Fogarty. How are you?
I'm very good, Tommy. Thank you very much for inviting me on.
Thank you for extending that invitation to actually be in your home in Dublin. Pádraic, I'm not gonna lie, I'm very excited for that podcast. And we were having a chat before we started recording, and there's no secret that I think that the part of a mission of Tommy's Outdoors is talk about conservation and protection of animals, protection of wildlife, and talking about these issues and make all people aware of that. So you're a campaign officer at Irish Wildlife Trust.
That's right, yeah.
So maybe you can just tell us what Irish Wildlife Trust is and what you're doing there.
Sure. Irish Wildlife Trust is one of quite a small number of environmental, non-governmental organisations in Ireland. It's been around since the 1970s. It was set up by people like Eamon de Butler and Gerrit van Gelderen, who were very well known in Ireland at that time during the 70s and 80s for bringing wildlife awareness to Ireland. We see our mission in the IWT as being to raise awareness of wildlife and to highlight the importance of wildlife to people as well, because that's people were a part of the environment. So that's very much what we see our mission as.
Okay, and what is it that you do in the Irish Wildlife Trust? The campaign officer is.
I'm the campaign officer. I was the chairman of the Irish Wildlife Trust for a number of years, starting nearly 10 years ago now. I was editor of their magazine until last year. And when I stopped being chairman, because I quite enjoyed the campaign work and the outreach part of it. So I was asked to continue being campaign officer. So that's pretty much what I do at the moment.
Yeah. And what the campaign work is like. So can you describe like what type of campaigns and what it's like? How does it work? And
there's a number of broad areas we work on. One would be, let's say, for instance, badger culling. So actually, for many years, the Irish Wildlife Trust has been campaigning to stop badger culling. Badgers are culled to in the name of controlling TB in cattle, which we believe doesn't work anyway. That's a long story, but that is one of the areas that we work on. We work on general agricultural policy as well, because Ireland is very much an agricultural country. So agriculture is going to have an enormous influence on our outdoors and our environment, for good or ill. So agriculture is always going to be an important area, and we do a lot of work on our national parks. As in trying to promote better protection of our national parks, and the last big area that we work on is the marine environment. So despite being an island nation, we don't have an enormous emphasis on the sea in Ireland, and
that's surprising.
Yeah, it is. I mean, for instance, a lot of people like to eat fish, but they'd have enormous disconnect as to thinking about where their fish comes from.
That's not only when it comes to fish. It's also when it comes to meat and in general products.
Maybe, right? Yeah. But I think there is generally a low level of awareness about the ocean.
No doubt.
And the sea and what goes on at sea and why it's important and all these things. And there's various reasons for that, but they would be the main issues that we work on.
Right. And okay, that's excellent. Listen, we get to the sea in a second, but you mentioned badger culling. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about what is the issue? So as far as I know, TB is bovine tuberculosis.
Tuberculosis. Bovine tuberculosis,
which is a cattle disease, and apparently, or like a lot of farmers think that the badgers are spreading or causing this disease to spread to cattle. Tell me, is it true? Is it not true? Is it only small aspect of it? Like how? Because the same thing is with deer, right?
Well, any mammal can carry bovine TB or TB. TB was mainly a problem for people up until the 1950s. A lot of people died from TB across Europe and in Ireland. And then there was a vaccine invented for TB, and TB in people more or less has disappeared. During the 1980s, TB became a big problem in cattle, and it was concluded that that badgers also carry TB, and that in order to control TB in cattle, they had to control the badgers. Now, at the time, this is the 1980s, this conclusion was drawn very reluctantly. A lot of people didn't want to bring badgers into the equation because the cattle gave TB to the badgers originally.
Yes.
Now, over the decades, a lot of people have forgotten that badgers were only ever thought to be a very small part of the problem. And so today, badgers are seen as being the main problem. Now, the inconvenient truth is that we're still very much with TB in cattle, and in fact, lately TB rates have gone up in cattle. This is despite nearly 30 years of culling badgers, and we kill about 6,000-7,000 badgers every year across the country.
Is there the number of badgers to be culled? Is how does this figure out? Is there numbers? Any research is done, or someone says like, okay, this is how many badgers we have in that area, so we taking 10%, or like?
Well,
or is it
generally
pretty much
the way
open
it works is that if a farm comes down with TB, the Department of Agriculture will move in and they will start culling badgers. So they don't necessarily have target numbers of badgers to kill. So it's more or less reactive. In that
so that's
way.
bad, right? Because even if you're culling, you need to know what is the population and how many animals you can take out of the population.
Well, we don't know how many badgers there are in Ireland. Really, there are kind of guessed numbers about the population, but they've never been surveyed properly. And then, of course, we have millions and millions of cattle, and the cattle herd is growing, and agriculture is becoming more intensive. Many of the cases of TB in cattle are only detected at the slaughterhouse, which means that cow or animal has been living in the herd all its life, potentially spreading the disease to its neighbours, etc. So the testing regime just isn't good enough, and that, from our point of view, that would be the main reason why we still have a TB problem, and really it has very little, if nothing, to do with badgers at all.
It sounds like is the badger population endangered in Ireland because of it? Because it seems, based on what you're saying, like we don't know how many badgers are there. And when the TB is detected, the government moves in and they start shooting badgers without any number. So that surely is not good.
The Department of Agriculture themselves have admitted that the TB program, the culling program, is not sustainable from the badger's point of view, and that it is leading to reduced populations of badgers in certain areas. Now, I'm not going to say the badger is an endangered species. It's not. There are still plenty of places where badgers are common, but nevertheless, we have large areas of the country where badgers are being eradicated at great public expense. With no particular results to report, because TB is still a major problem.
Yeah, because they're only part of a part of a problem. Okay, so that's good to hear that they're not at least endangered. Are badger protected?
Yes, yeah,
they're protected species, so they're not classified as vermin, I presume.
No, they've been a protected species in the 1970s. The Department of Agriculture needs a license to cull the badgers, but what we found out through our research is that basically they're given the license every year, rubber stamped. There's no oversight of the culling program. There's no conservation assessment. So there's very little being done to protect the badger in all of this.
Yeah. And Irish Wildlife Trust is dealing with issues like that and trying to campaign to put a okay. So maybe now is a good moment to say, like, how if right now one of the listeners says, like, well, this is great, how can I support Irish Wildlife Trust? How they can support work?
Well, the best thing you can do is become a member. It's a membership organisation, so I think the joining fee is around €35 a year, and that is the most direct way you can of supporting us. And then in return, you get our wonderful magazine, and you get to join in our events throughout the year.
Right. It's pretty much like a shark trust. So I'm a member of a shark trust, and speaking about sharks, because that's a little bit how we come to even recording that podcast. When I moved to Ireland 11 years ago, I discovered that there are actually sharks around Ireland, right? Atlantic Ocean. So, which wasn't that obvious, because then I was talking with a young lady. She was a teacher in elementary school, and she said, "There's no sharks here. What you talking about? There's no sharks here." And I showed her a photo of me with the shark. I said, like, "No, it's not possible. There's not this. What is this? There's no sharks here." I said, like, "Oh God, she's a teacher in a school, right?" But anyway, so I learned there are the sharks, and so obviously I quickly discovered there is a huge number of people who are doing shark fishing, and there are charter boats, and I found a charter boat and with a skipper who later became my good colleague, and I went mad shark fishing. I was doing like 10 trips in a season. So essentially in a season when the blue sharks are around, it's like, charter boats every weekend. So that was great. But immediately what I've done, I read the book called Sharks in British Waters, I think. And then from that book, I learned there's something like Shark Trust. And so it was like very natural to me, like, okay, if I'm interacting with the animal, I want to learn something. And an immediate question is like, okay, how many there out there, right? Is it popular? So this is a little bit like my questions about the badgers, like what is the number? Is it sustainable? Are they endangered? Should we even fish for them? Etc. So that's very natural, and I think that the Irish Wildlife Trust is a little bit like that organization. Just become a member, and then you have a magazine, but primarily you supporting the work towards conservation, either in Irish wildlife in that case or sharks. So how it started was I think it was a tweet on Twitter where there was a report of anglers catching many porbeagle sharks. And a porbeagle shark, I think it depends on the population. They're either listed as threatened or an endangered species. And a comment on the tweet was, "Oh, it's reported as a catch of the lifetime, but really it shouldn't be. They shouldn't be caught by anglers because they're endangered and threatened." And then I tweeted like, "Well, yes, but they are still exploited commercially." And I think then you jump in and we kind of started talking about it, how my point was like hunters and anglers are really an ally, or should be allies in conservation of not only marine wildlife, but in general in the wildlife. And yeah, I suppose I don't want to put the words in your mouth, but I suppose your point was like, it's not always happening. It's sometimes happening when it's enforced, like in the salmon fishery. In the shark fishery, there's actually no regulations in the shark fishery. So then it's like, oh, would you like to come on the podcast? And this is how it happened that we're sitting at a table. So tell me, what's your point of view, and maybe in general, about the shark population, species of shark, and is it good, bad, indifferent, and how these issues look from your perspective?
Yeah, well, just to maybe zoom out a bit, I mean, people are familiar with sharks, but they're an incredibly diverse group of animals. There's hundreds of types of sharks around the world. And in Ireland, I can't remember what the exact figure is, but it's over 50 different types of sharks. And then you've got rays as well, and they're kind of related species. And most of these animals are top predators in the ocean. So they play the same role as, lions and tigers do on land. And the more we learn about ecology and how ecosystems work, the more important we realize the top predators are in any ecosystem. And so sharks are really, really important for healthy oceans. They also have unusual lifestyles. So a lot of sharks live for a long time. A lot of them have live babies. And they don't have very many babies. So it means that when you start drawing down a shark population, or when a population starts shrinking, it takes an awful lot longer for that population to recover, because they have long gestation periods. For instance, one of the sharks we have in Irish waters, the spur dog, has the longest gestation period of any animal known. It was over 2 years, which is incredible.
Is spur dog the fish that the stocks were so depleted because they were being caught as a part of like fish and chips? They were called rock salmon. Yeah. So rock salmon, that was actually spur dog, and I know history from our friend who is running charter boat, that there was I think in County Clare, the whole fleet showed up and they kind of wiped out the spur dogs, and they move on to the next big thing. And it would take years and years and years before like a single spur dog was caught again by anglers.
Yeah, that's right. People were eating it as rock salmon, and the population crashed. So the spur dog is one of those endangered species, and it may be recovering, we don't really know, but it'll take a very long time because of the life history of the animal. And a lot of the rays as well would share that feature. They live for a very long time, and they have very few babies. So the other thing to know about sharks and rays is that they're one of the most threatened groups of animals in Ireland, or in Irish waters within the North Atlantic. About 60% of the species of sharks and rays are threatened with extinction to one degree or another. So this is enormous. The average would be around a third. So they're very, very threatened. So what we're left with now, even though there's no commercial fishing for sharks in Irish waters, and even though anglers who are targeting sharks are, I would say 100% of the time, they're putting the animals back alive. It's not like the 1960s where the animals were killed to be brought ashore to be weighed. So even though those things are happening, the populations of many of the species are very, very low. The poor beagle shark you mentioned, for instance, is critically endangered. Now, critically endangered is, it's one step towards complete extinction.
Yep.
So the situation is very, very precarious for these species.
Just on the poor beagle, just to stop for the poor beagle for a second, is that the population around Irish water that is critically endangered? Because there's like two populations of poor beagle shark. I don't know, is the east and western population. So, and one of them is critically endangered. The other one is just threatened or just endangered.
That's right. There are different populations around the world of poor beagle sharks, but in Irish waters, it's classified as critically endangered. Yeah.
But they're still being taken by commercial fishermen.
Well, not legally, they're not. It is illegal to land a poor beagle shark.
Oh, it is illegal
in the European Union. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But then they being part of as a bycatch.
Well, of course, there's all kinds of fishing going on. There's very little supervision.
So this interesting thing that you said, that in the European Union it's illegal, but you go to and you even see that the photographs of the fish market in Spain, and you have boxes of poor beagle sharks there.
Well, that shouldn't be happening, but I can't doubt you. We had a situation here in the last 12 months where somebody sent us a photograph of a poor beagle shark in a supermarket in Dublin.
Okay.
And when we contacted the supermarket, they told us that they were very conservation minded, but they didn't know what kind of an animal it was, and they didn't know it was a poor beagle shark, and they didn't know it was critically endangered, and they didn't know it was illegal to have it on the fishmonger slab. So,
is it illegal to have it and sell poor beagle full stop, or is it illegal to sell Irish water caught poor beagle? Because then you open it clearly, oh yeah, but it was caught somewhere else.
The illegal bit is landing it.
Yeah.
So it is illegal to land a poor beagle shark and some other species as well. Now, by the time it gets to the supermarket, I mean, we reported this to the authorities at the time, and they did an investigation, but they felt they didn't have enough evidence to actually bring a prosecution. But to me, it showed the lack of awareness about these amazing animals and the threats that they're under, and that a supermarket that could think of itself as being conservation minded to have done this tells me that there's there are problems there.
Yeah. Well, I think it's just their line that they're conservation minded regardless of anything.
Well, that's quite true. Yeah.
Because they don't know. Okay, that's very interesting. So you mentioned that in general, in your work, I suppose, do you see anglers or maybe wider hunters and anglers, the outdoorsmen in general, as an allies in the work, or as an enemies who are, if we remove them, they're not gonna, there's one less element to worry about? Like, how, from the perspective of Irish Wildlife Trust, or from your perspective, how do you see that relation?
Oh, we certainly don't see anglers as enemies. Anglers are the people who know more about what's happening at sea than anybody else, and commercial fishermen too. And we know that most anglers are very, very conservation minded. So we don't have any beef with anglers. We don't have any difficulty with anglers. We do have what we would like to see is better regulation. And this goes for anything that happens in the sea, whether you're catching fish commercially or whether you're doing it for recreation, that there needs to be proper measures in place to make sure that conservation comes first.
Yeah.
And I think most anglers wouldn't have any difficulty with that.
Yeah.
So we do see bad practices. Sharks, for instance, are very sensitive to being hauled out of the water.
Yeah.
They're not designed to be out of the water.
Yeah.
So catching them, and they're not evolved to be caught. They're top predators. So for a shark to be, caught on the end of a hook and dragged out of the sea is a stressful thing for a shark.
No doubt.
We know there's not a lot of research, but we know there is some research on certain types of skates, for instance, that when they suffer that stress, they abort their babies.
All right.
And that happens.
I know that stingray is particularly vulnerable. Is particularly sensitive to stress as well. Stingrays. That's it.
And then, so the point of all that is that if you're going to catch a shark, handling it properly and being able to manage it properly is really, really important.
Yeah.
And we see in Northern Ireland at the moment, for instance, there's a project going on to try and train anglers in good handling practices and tagging and all of that.
How are they doing that? And then they ideally should be lifted off the water in a kind of like a cradle or something, right? That's the idea. I know there is a Shark Trust video online how to properly handle shark, and they have a special device like a cradle when they kind of putting that under the shark and lifting it out of the water this way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you should never use a hook to grab the animal out of the water. The animal should be horizontal at all times because they don't have a rib cage.
Yeah.
So, and because they're evolved to be in water, suddenly if they're on dry land and they're turned upside down or they're hauled up by their fins, their innards basically sloosh to the bottom of their bodies.
Yeah.
And that puts their heart under tremendous strain, and they can die from that kind of thing. So, so they're the kind of things that they recommend. The Shark Trust recommends that you don't lift the animal at all. So you have to remember, for instance, that if we're putting conservation first, the most important thing is not to get a photograph of the thing you've just caught. The most important thing is to get the animal back in the water as quickly as possible. And I don't have a difficulty with the sport angling element of it, or even taking a photograph of it. But certainly, I don't believe that the animal should be lifted up or hauled into the air just for the sake of a photograph and a social media moment. And as I say, I go back to the point that we're not talking here about pollock and cod. We're talking about some of the most endangered species on the planet. So, for instance, you wouldn't dream of licensing hunting white rhinos or Bengal tigers, and yet we can go out and catch these animals off our shores with no regulation whatsoever.
Yeah, I suppose that's a big problem, and also commercial pressure on that is a problem, because there is this argument, and it'd be interesting to hear your opinion about that. But regardless what you do, like even if you get anglers at it Wild West style, and you can kill every single shark you're gonna catch and so on, that's still just minuscule compared to what is happening through the commercial sector. Is that your opinion, that there's a disproportion here? But because I think that the part of that, and I completely agree with your sentiment that, and this is kind of repeated, and which I'm very happy to hear that from you, and I heard that before, that anglers and people who are out there interacting with the nature, interacting with those animals, know probably more than anyone else because they're there every day or every weekend. But I think that the part where most often you hear the pushback is like, well, why they feel like they're an easy target. Why are you pushing back on us? There's this and that measures proposed or introduced or recommended, while commercial fishermen are going out there and they're catching this many tons of sharks that are then being discarded or whatever else. What's your view on that?
I mean, I would totally agree. Commercial fishing in general is the biggest pressure on our oceans.
It's tough because how you influence that. This is like an economy. This is like a economy of a country, and you have a minister who deals with that. So that must be very hard to influence and do anything about it.
Well, commercial fishing, industrial fishing is regulated. You have the common fisheries policy, you've got, quotas and all these kind of things. You've got areas where they're allowed to go. Now,
the quotas are like a 5 times over scientific recommendation.
Yeah, of course. And the other problem is that we don't know what's happening out at sea. So particularly when it comes to bycatch.
Yeah.
And industrial fleet, like you see these super trawlers coming out, they could be dragging anything out of the sea.
Yeah.
And we just don't know what's going on. But take, for instance, common skate, flapper skate,
Yeah.
I think is what they're called these days. Flapper skate are critically endangered species. They've disappeared from the Irish Sea. They may be recovering around the southwest coast because we see more of them. Now, boats know where these skates are, and they may be targeted every weekend. So the same boat might be going out every weekend to catch the same fish with different people. Now, what effect...
You're talking about the anglers now?
Yeah, talking about anglers, yeah. So what effect is that having on those particular skate? So it's not really a question of saying, well, the industrial fleet is much worse than the angling. We're looking at the angling may be having a negative impact. Now, I am pretty sure that any angler who considers themselves conservation-minded would not be comfortable with the idea that they might be having a negative effect on the population of these fish.
Or that they're getting catch the fish that was caught week before and 2 weeks earlier and 3 weeks earlier.
Yeah. And so that is why I come back to the point that what we would like to see is good regulation and good measures so that these fish can recover. Now remember, they're severely depleted. So we're not trying to pin blame on any one sector. We're trying to put in measures so that the fish can recover properly to healthy populations, and that is the priority. And I think that would be a great thing for anglers. So that's why I think anglers should support what we're talking about.
Absolutely. I have no doubt about it. You know, before we move on the subject of anglers and protection, because I want, you know, I think it's a story I was talking about in another podcast, but before I go to that, I want to give an example of Poland where there is a regulations for anglers on the number of cod that you can catch, which is I raised my hand up. I don't remember. Is it either 5 or 8? It's been probably 15 years since I was angling for cod in Poland. However, there are commercial fleet operating and catching cod. So what's happening is that, well, number one, in Poland, mostly there's like old trawlers that are taking anglers, and it doesn't look like in Ireland where boats are, you know, really suited for 6 people. I know they're taking 12 because that's what P5 license says, 12 people, but really they're small boats. In Poland, these are like a big trawlers. And so there's a fish, that's a commercial vessel that can otherwise hold the whole, you know, tons of cod. But now they have anglers which are allowed, you know, 5 or 8 fish. So obviously that creates that kind of, well, maybe it's not a gray area, but, you know, every angler said, like, why am I, you know, going out, paying, you know, traveling sometimes from the central Poland, you know, 600 kilometers, and now I'm allowed to. So what was happening, because that trip to the sea, especially from people who live in the mountain or in the central Poland, was like also to get fish. So that was getting to the point where they were catching cod with a rod and line, you know, 5, 8 or whatever it was. But then on the way in, they were stopping by another commercial vessel and they were buying, you know, like a 20 kilo of fish, and that was legal. So that's the, like, if a law is badly constructed, it's not being followed, because like it doesn't make sense. Because then if you have even officer on the shore that say like, oh, show me how many fish you caught, it's like, oh, I only caught 4, 5. What about this 20 more? Oh, I just bought them from this fisherman over there, and because of a skipper that you're in is also commercial fisherman and he knows the other guy, then, you know, and for fishermen that's business too, right? They're not gonna say like, okay, lads, stop fishing, we going back because you caught your quota. So I think that's still important when you're introducing those regulations, to kind of take both sides, so, you know, it works, right?
I think the key to any exploitation is good management.
Yeah, no doubt.
And that is sounds simple, but it's such a hard thing to get your head around, or certainly it's such a hard thing to implement. Certainly we've never seen it in Ireland. people can imagine super trawlers and the enormous capacity they have.
I don't think people
damage.
can imagine. It's unimaginable the size of the net that is being dragged. It's just like.
But what I mean is that it seems obvious that a super trawler can do enormous damage. Whereas it seems harder to understand how somebody with a fishing rod can do damage on anywhere near the scale.
Yeah.
But there are stories in Ireland where species have gone practically extinct with no equipment whatsoever. Now, I can give you an example of the purple sea urchin. Purple sea urchin is a little spiky creature that lives, anybody who's been on their holidays in the Mediterranean might be familiar with it. And it used to cover the rocks across the west coast of Ireland, from Kerry all across the coast of Clare, the north coast of Galway Bay. And when they opened a market for purple sea urchins to France in the 1970s, people just went down with bags and put them in bags. And then when they were gone, people went down at low tide. And then when they were gone, people went out with snorkels. And then people went out with scuba diving gear until all the urchins were gone. And they're still gone. Yeah. So it comes back to the point about good management. No matter what you're doing, it has to be managed. Whether it's a super trawler or whether it's the angling sector, or whether it's aquaculture, or anybody doing anything that's taking things out of the sea. You can imagine fishing for crabs as one of the lowest impact types of fishing we have. You put a basket into the bottom of the sea, the crab calls in, you're not destroying the seafloor, very little bycatch. But what if you've got 20,000 of these baskets on the bottom of the sea? What if you're catching bait to put in the baskets from some other fish population that isn't regulated? What if those baskets that get washed away in a storm and they end up catching crabs forevermore? These are the problems that we face. This is not a hypothetical scenario. This is happening. Nobody can tell you how many pots there are for crabs or lobsters in Ireland. There are thousands and thousands of them because there's no limit. So
lack of management.
Lack of management. That is the key. And that is why it's always very easy to say, well, look over there at that damage that's being done over there. Of course, we want it all regulated. We want the super trawlers regulated. We want the crab fishing regulated. It all has to be regulated. And there are encouraging signs that is happening. The European Commission has identified the fact that smaller boats and the angling sector are not regulated, that there's no record of what is being caught and where it's being caught, and there are regulations being brought in to change that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Listen, and you touch on the EU regulation, and so first of all, maybe before I go there, is there much pushback from the commercial sector and angling alike for these initiatives?
Well, I've heard nothing from angling representative bodies. I have had comments from various individual anglers. I've had conversations with a number of the state bodies, and I've met with Inland Fisheries Ireland, who have a very important role to play. They're the ones who are supposed to be in charge of sea angling and promoting it. And at the moment, they're not doing a very good job of promoting the conservation side of things. It seems to me, they're more interested in promoting the tourist dividends that can be got from sea angling, whereas conservation really needs to be absolutely front and center in all of these things.
But I suppose now is a good moment to kind of talk about bass fishing, right? Because bass fisheries, it's big in Ireland and in the UK. So I suppose the angle on tourism was to show that because there's a ban on commercial fishing for bass. You cannot catch the sea bass, you cannot sell sea bass, and so on. And I suppose the angle was always that it is worth, a fish in the water is worth more because of a tourism aspect than being caught by commercial fishermen. Because they were, I think it was, 6 years ago, there was a big action where it was, I don't know whether it was just rumors or whether it was more than rumors, that the Ireland will open commercial fishery for sea bass again. And I know that there was like a big pushback, and even the Bass Angler Society in the UK, I think, got involved quite in that. So I think this is how the fishery is trying to promote conservation through showing the value. But I think that this year, angling for sea bass is catch and release only. And I heard the comments, like a negative comments about that, because obviously, like most of people I know, it doesn't bother because almost everybody I know is catch and release for bass because they slow growing, the population collapsed and they start to recover and so on and so on. But then there's a lot of pushback again on the basis like, well, yeah, but they're still being caught commercially in the UK waters. Why the catch and release is kind of imposed on anglers rather than do something with a commercial fisher, which is not that far away. What's your take on that issue of catch and release, mandatory catch and release bass fishing in Ireland?
Yeah, I mean, I can see it seems ludicrous, doesn't it, to be enforcing these restrictions and then be allowing commercial fishing going on in some other parts of the fish's distribution.
Yeah.
So I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for that. The bass population is collapsed, as you say. So I mean, I think.
And do you mean it's collapsed from the state of recovery, or is it like was collapsed and it's still collapsed? Because there is also like for a number of years the number of catch is is less. So do you think that after that initial rebound, another like a collapse happened? Is this what you think?
As far as I know, the bass there's no sign yet that bass population is recovering.
Well, I mean, from the state in 70s or where the
I don't know of any evidence that it is rebounding or growing.
That's very interesting because that is like a common theme that once the closed season was introduced and once the restrictions were put in place, the population starts to recover. That's just common. I don't have any data about it, so maybe this is exactly what you're saying. There's no data that they start recovering.
Yeah, and it is monitored.
Already. So we probably debunked just right now on that podcast.
Well,
we debunked one of the biggest kind of like, the population of bass starts to recover, and now like
that is what you would expect to happen. But look what Atlantic salmon. We've had 10 years now of a ban of drift net fishing. Mm-hmm. The commercial drift net fishermen were told that the drift netting for salmon was the problem.
Yeah.
And that once they stopped, the salmon would come back. Now the drift netting has stopped and the salmon have not come back. Now this raises worrying questions about exactly what the state of our sea is. We have obviously not only chronic overfishing across the water, we have habitat destruction from trawling, we have unregulated super trawlers, we have climate change, we have pollution, we have all kinds of things that we have thrown at the sea. And it may well be that some of our marine ecosystems are damaged beyond repair.
Yeah,
we don't know. We've taken all the sharks out. I mean, we take millions and hundreds of millions of sharks out of the sea every year.
Yeah, I think the last mako was caught in like 1973, I think. Or...
In Ireland?
Yeah.
Maybe. I'm not sure the mako was ever a common shark in Ireland, but...
but around in British waters, it was, because it like at the time, I think it was in the 60s, the blue sharks were treated as a like a pest, like unwanted bycatch because people were going out for makos, and there's now no makos around. So poor beagle's another example.
Yeah,
like they said.
Even cod. I mean, cod is a big predatory fish.
Yeah.
Cod, an adult cod can grow up to 7-8 years of age, can be the size of this dinner table. And they're big fish. They exert a lot of pressure on the other fish around them in a healthy ecosystem. Now, we have removed all of the big fish around our seas. The cod that we find in Ireland are baby cod.
Yes.
So they are not playing the role in the ecosystem that they used to. So we've taken out all of the big predatory fish, not only the sharks and the skates, but the cod and the whiting and the big, we used to have halibut around the Atlantic coast. All of the turbot are gone. All of these fish are gone. The ecosystem is in tatters. So, you're talking about bass or salmon or any of these things. These are just tiny little remnants of populations that we're dealing with at the moment.
Got it. So even if anyone thinks that there's a recovery because this year he got 10 fish and then last year got 3, it's like maybe you just got better at catching them.
An extra crumb.
Yeah. Got that. Is it all that bad? Is there any chance? Is it all doom and gloom, or do we have any,
Well, I
hope?
mean, we look to, this is the extraordinary thing. I mean, Ireland is a rich country, but if you want to look for hopeful examples, we have to look to the tropics, where countries much poorer than Ireland have been addressing these issues and have been creating marine protected areas and getting rid of the damaging fishing practices out of areas. And many of them have shown that fish populations bounce back very, very quickly.
Yeah.
There's one example, for instance, it's well known online. Anyone can search for it. Is in Mexico, where they got rid of all commercial fishing out of this small area of coral reef in Mexico, and within 5 years, the sea was absolutely teeming with fish again. Now we're told, that's Mexico. It won't work in Ireland. The Atlantic Ocean is different. The water is different. The fish are different. But it has never been tried. And there was an experiment. There's one very small experiment in Norway where they closed off a square kilometre. It's a very small area.
Yeah.
And the cod bounced back within 2 or 3 years. The cod got bigger. They got older. Old fish have more babies. So an adult female fish produces millions of babies. Within a few years, the sea is full of fish again. And that is just something that we haven't got our heads around in Ireland yet.
Yeah. And do you think there's a chance that this is going to happen?
The funny thing is that we've already signed up to it. It's already the law, but yet it still hasn't happened.
I don't know if it's good or bad. It's probably bad if it's supposed to be happening. It's not happening.
Yeah, it can be quite disheartening when the government signs up to laws. They have said they will create marine protected areas by 2020, so that's not very far away, and yet they have done absolutely nothing about it. And it's just a double shame, because this isn't just about protecting individual species from extinction.
Yeah.
This is about bringing back the livelihoods of people who live along the coast. It's about there being more fish for recreational anglers, for instance.
Yeah.
Any recreational angler I've spoken to will tell you that the seas are empty compared to what they were only in the 1980s.
Yeah.
Anybody who has lived that long, which is not very long, will tell you the seas are just empty compared to what they were. So we need, there's huge opportunities in marine protected areas and good management that I spoke about.
Yeah, that's everything. Yeah, there's common, like even in African countries also, like a local economy collapse. I think it was in Gambia, where Gambia sold rights to fish their waters to the EU. And again, the super trawlers showed up, and within a few years, there was a big shore angling festival in Gambia, which was moved. I don't remember when it was moved, because there was no fish, and the local economy, local fishermen, they essentially that was completely wiped the species fish. Right. So I suppose to support these is there. So obviously we can support this work, and I suppose the lobbying is the word, government through Irish Wildlife Trust. What are the other ways? Like anyone who's listening to that podcast is like terrified, because I'm terrified, in the state of you're essentially not saying anything new, but kind of hearing that once again is like, oh my God, that it doesn't look good. So what is there anything, or does it need to just get to the point where it's going to be so bad that then the commercial sector itself either, stop existing because there's nothing to catch anymore, or they start kind of thinking about any conservation measures?
Well, I'll give you a slightly hopeful story then.
Please.
Anglers, particularly in the southwest of the country, will know about this pair trawling. So pair trawling is two boats dragging one net between them, and particularly towards the end of the year, around November, December, people in Kenmare and West Cork and the Shannon Estuary have seen these pair trawlers come in, and they sieve everything out of the water. So they're targeting these small little fish called sprat. which then go off to be churned into fish meal. But the sprat really is the basis of the food chain. They're the food for the whales and the dolphins and the bigger fish and the seabirds and everything. So this has been a pretty damaging situation. Now, anglers in those areas have been very vocal in contacting their local politicians. So this is kind of democracy in action. Politicians listen to people who are shouting in their ears. And we worked with a lot of anglers in Kerry and West Cork to say that, we're going to do what we can from Dublin and from the lobbying the Department of Agriculture. But you are the people in the local area. You see this happening. You need to contact your local politician and tell them why this matters and bring this damage to their attention. And a lot of them have done that. Now, the story I say is partly hopeful because earlier this year, the Minister for the Marine, Michael Creed, said that they were thinking about banning pair trawling. So they put a public consultation out there, and they let people have their say. Now, we eagerly await the result of that. But we very much hope that the thinking there is that pair trawling in these areas is absolutely bonkers. Yeah. That it is insanely destructive, and we need to do something about it. So that's what I say. It's halfway to a hopeful story. If it does happen and the pair trawling is banned, local people in that area of Cork and Kerry can say, well, they played a very important role in making it happen. And that goes to show that these things can happen, and they do happen.
Yeah, because politicians, they listen if enough people.
They do.
So what's the best place to kind of keep in touch in these sort of things, and know where to kind of jump into action and write a letter to your local, politicians? Is it through Facebook or Twitter or like a printed media, just to say like, well, if I want to be involved and I want to write a letter to every single time there is something I can contribute in any way or make my voice heard, what would be the best way to do it?
I think good old-fashioned picking up the phone to talk to your local politician. I mean, particularly in Ireland, politicians do ring you back. Yeah. And they do answer emails. Yeah. And they like to be seen to be addressing local concerns.
Yeah. But in the first place, how to even know about it? How to even know that there is a trawling going on?
Oh, that there is an issue. Well,
so yeah.
Well, I suppose in this particular example, the anglers we worked with could see it happening. They were there when they could see the boats going up and down. Yeah. So it's pretty obvious. There's also whale watching boats in that part of the world who have watched how the amount of fish has disappeared because of these fishing practices. So I think the point of it all is that we have to get political about these decisions.
Yes.
And we have to recognize that we are fortunate to live in a democracy, and people do have individual power when it comes to their vote.
That's very. I mean, that's very important. That's a very important point that we can make a difference, especially if enough people will do it. And then when you talked about all your, angling buddies and your friends and your family, and say, hey, this is going through education. And I suppose how to know about the issue, like if people subscribe just to, I presume, Facebook page or Twitter feed on Irish Wildlife Trust, they can probably hear and read about all the issues with badgers and marine wildlife.
Oh, very much so, yeah.
Listen, I have another question. Actually, I have two more questions for you. A little bit deviating now. Let's leave marine conservation and that. I have a question about deer population in Ireland. So again, I'm kind of looking for alternative viewpoint, because just this year I completed the HCAP, which is Hunter Certified Assessment Program. And anyone you ask about deer population in Ireland, it seems to be like, oh, there's more and more deer, more than ever, and we need to shoot them and cull them and so on. And to be honest, that doesn't sit right with me. Because to the point that we make earlier about the badgers, is there any survey done? How do we know how much deer? And maybe we do. So this is a genuine question. How does the conservation status of deer, various species of deer, looks in Ireland?
Well, the simple answer is we have no idea how many deer there are in Ireland because nobody has ever gone to count them. Deer were quite rare animals in the 1970s. The red deer, for instance, which is our own sort of native deer.
The one in Kerry.
The one in Kerry.
Yeah.
And that was reduced to very low numbers in
and it's
Killarney.
protected.
And they're all protected.
Mm-hmm.
The fallow deer was introduced during Norman times, I think, from mainland Europe. And the Sika deer is an import from Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And the Sika deer are the ones that you'll find mostly around Wicklow area.
Mm-hmm.
So I think from low levels, there's no doubt that the distribution of deer has increased. So in other words, there are deer now where there were no deer in the past. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people can interpret that as saying, oh, look, there's millions of deer just because they weren't there the last time I looked and now I'm seeing them. But the bottom line is that we have no idea how many deer there are. It may just be that deer are, changing, they're going to other areas. We think, for instance, in the Kerry area, deer are being more noticeable in towns where people live because there's not much for them to eat up in the hills and in the forest. There's not much nutrition for them. The national parks, they go out and shoot deer occasionally. Mm-hmm. But there's a big difference between shooting the deer and managing them.
Yes.
We're very good in Ireland for shooting things, but we're not so great at actually managing them, and because that's the hard part. And deer are a very important part of our heritage and our wildlife. But at the end of the day, ecology requires a predator, and we don't have wolves in Ireland.
Yeah.
And until we get our wolves back, deer will not face any serious pressure on their numbers.
Oh, okay.
You can look at Scotland, for instance, where they do count deer, and they can see that the deer population has gone up a lot in Scotland.
Scotland is a very interesting situation in Scotland because it seems like all the hunting outfits want to keep deer on the hills, while the all ecology-minded people in the ecological organization, they actually want to remove deer. They want to shoot all the deer because they apparently change the landscape and there's no native flora anymore in Scotland. So that's quite interesting. Interesting situation because for the casual listener, you would imagine that ecological organizations want to protect all the animals, and in the case, they actually want to remove all the deer from the highlands.
Well, I think in fairness, I think a lot of environmental organizations like our own would like to see proper ecosystems being restored. That means having your predators and your deer and your small animals and your birds and your plants, everything working together. When you take out a whole layer of an ecosystem, like we did when we drove our wolves to extinction, then the ecosystem isn't working anymore the way that it's supposed to.
Yeah. And would you like to see the wolves being introduced back in Ireland?
Oh, I would very much.
Yeah.
I think.
Don't you think that would create even more problems?
Like what?
I'm looking at the situation where the wolves were introduced in the United States, where the animal where they introduce their set the goals, how many how the recovery looks like, and once they achieve that recovery, now the wolf population also needs to be managed. Now there's a big pushback because people don't like to see wolf being shot, right? Because they're these majestic, beautiful animals. So the population of wolves going up, and again, there's a problem with I think that problem is also in Europe, in Greece, where obviously farmers are, their livestock being damaged. The insurance companies don't like wolves anymore because they need to pay farmers money for their livestock being killed. Hoofed animals are getting killed as well. So there's too many deer, too many wolves. Then the population of deer and other, goats or wild sheep is going down, and all that creates so much tension, which probably for the environment and environmental movement is not good because you have all these various interests. These people want wolves, these doesn't want wolf, and so on. So And these are much bigger areas than in Ireland. So do you think that Ireland has enough of wilderness to introduce big predator like wolf? Or the part of introduction is like, oh, let's take some of the farmland and turn it into wilderness, so we actually have space for them.
I think there's a lot going on when you start talking about wolves. If you look at the facts, right, forget about the emotion for a moment.
Yes.
And I don't want to dismiss that because, that is important as well. But if we look at the facts, wolves don't need wilderness. There was a wolf recorded this week in Belgium. Belgium is as far from wilderness as you'll ever get. Yeah. And there are wolves there. Most of the wolves in Europe are in farming landscapes. Yeah. And they're in mountainous areas. So wolves can survive quite well in all kinds of environments. They don't need what humans consider to be wilderness. The wolves just need something to eat. So the question of there being enough area in Ireland, there's plenty of area. And there's also probably plenty for them to eat. And I'm thinking in terms of the deer numbers at the moment. Yeah. Wolves historically in Ireland probably would have eaten wild boar. Of course, we have driven wild boar to extinction as well. And of course, we don't have much forest. But I think if we're going to restore our forests and our bogs and all these things, I think we need to bring these elements of the ecosystem back. And the other thing is about how humans feel about living with wolves. This is a much more complex issue because you're dealing with people's psychology and your emotions. And as I say, I'm not trying to dismiss that. But if, again, you look at the facts of where wolves live in Europe, they live in northern Spain and across Eastern Europe and the Alps and then through Italy and Scandinavia. Places that have had wolves for a long time don't tend to be controversial. It is where wolves are new, where they haven't been seen in many decades. People have forgotten what it's like to have wolves around them. The farmers have forgotten the techniques that they use to protect their sheep and their cattle against the wolves. This is where the real controversy and conflict is happening. Yes. But you go to places, let's say in the mountains of northern Spain, the farmers there have been living with wolves for centuries. They know how to look after their flocks. The level of losses from sheep are very, very low, relatively speaking. Okay. So the point that it comes down to is coexistence. Can humans tolerate wolves? Can we bring ourselves to live with them? Now, it's very easy for me living in a city to say that I really want wolves back. Because people are putting they children cannot walk to school. And they organizing buses and so on because they were afraid of wolves. Okay, but again, this is into the Brothers Grimm kind of fairy stories. You have to go back about 500 years in Europe to find, or in Ireland anyway, to find stories of wolf attacks on people. I know of no examples anywhere in Europe of a recent attack of a person by a wolf. Oh, recent, yeah, of course. There's not enough of them. Maybe, and I'm not saying can't happen. They're dangerous. But the point is that compared to the number of people who get knocked down on the road or something like that, there is an irrational element to the wolf. Of course. You imagine all the newspapers when someone was killed by a wolf. Oh yeah, how many people get killed by a car? Yeah, no news. Absolutely, right? Nothing. So again, it comes down to whether we can tolerate wildlife. Now, in Ireland, we have driven so much of our wildlife to extinction. We have nowhere in Ireland that resembles a functioning ecosystem or a wild area that has wild animals in it. It is so tame that we have just lost all this relationship to nature. And again, as I say, it comes down to this question of tolerance. Now, I would not be in favor of, imposing wolves on people who live in the countryside. But what I hope might happen is that in time, people will see the benefits of wolves in the landscape. Because I think wolves can be really beneficial. Yeah, I doubt people will see it. To be honest, I doubt without any
big, educational campaign that will take generations. I mean, like farmers, not like farmers, farmers. They don't even want goats on their farms because they presenting grazing competition to their sheep, right?
The farmers
start talking about wolves to them.
Yeah, the farmers in Ireland didn't want eagles 20 years ago. They were quite against it, bringing eagles back because they feared for their lambs. And now we have eagles. Right? Okay, there's not a huge number of them, but the farmers have no problems with them. And the farmers have noticed that where they have eagles, they don't have so many crows to deal with.
Yeah.
Because the ecosystem it begins to restore itself. And you take, for instance, farmers spend an awful lot of time shooting foxes, and deer are beginning to be a problem on farmland. And there's no substitute for natural control like the wolf can provide for the whole ecosystem.
Yeah. Okay, that's very interesting. I never expected that we're gonna go into talking about wolves, but that's fascinating. You actually have a book about the Irish ecosystem that was destroyed. Really, can you tell a few words about your
last
book
year
and where to get it?
I wrote a book called Whittled Away, which is about Ireland's vanishing nature. So the title is kind of self-explanatory, but really I felt that it was not widely known just how much nature is disappearing before our eyes in Ireland, on land and at sea. Like it literally is just going down the plug hole.
Yeah. And do you think that like a development of industry and farming is playing a role here? Because this is my point. It's all great, and let's say we can wave the magic wand, and the wild boar will reappear again, and the wolves will reappear again, and eagles and all that. I mean, like where, right? Like is like expansion of the farmlands, and is that not playing the role? Is it not required? So my point is, like, if we're talking about reintroduction of wild animals, top predators and so on, would it doesn't have to be supported by programs of buying land of the farmers and saying, like, well, now that land is used for, I know, as you said, that maybe we not need that much of the wilderness, but at the same time, those animals were well eradicated for a reason. That happened for a reason, right?
Well, the question of where to put them. One example would be the bogs in the Midlands, which have been destroyed. So less than 1% of the bogs are left, and all of that area has been basically mined out of existence. Now, Board Namona, which is the body who has been industrially extracting peat, has said itself that it won't be extracting peat in just a little over 10 years' time. And that's quite a big area. I think the area is about 50,000 hectares of land along the River Shannon. Now, those peatlands, they will never be bogs again like we knew them, but they could be wild areas. Absolutely. Coillte, for instance, Coillte is the forestry company, which has an enormous amount of land at the moment, which is mostly in plantations of conifers, which, you'd struggle to even walk through them, never mind, expect a wild animal to live in it. An awful lot of those forests make a loss. They not only cost taxpayers money, but they pollute the water. And
really? That's
they're
interesting.
really environmentally damaging. So what if we were to convert...
Because it's a monoculture?
Because it's a monoculture, they have to be sprayed with pesticides. They're sprayed with fertilizers that get into the soil. They're an absolute disaster. So there's this huge area of land that could be transformed into native forest. So I'm talking about land that's already owned by the public.
Yeah. And it's not making money, like you're saying. It's making loss.
No, there's absolutely no logic to what's going on at the moment. So we could have rewilded areas of bogs, we could have new native forests at very little public expense, and they would be amazing places for wildlife. They would be beautiful recreational areas. They would provide clean water. They would help us meet our climate change targets. They would do all these things that our land use at the moment is failing utterly to do.
Okay. And to help support all that, the best thing to do is to become a member of Irish Wildlife Trust.
Absolutely, number one.
That's perfect. Listen, one last question. There's a lot of talk recently about the Heritage Bill, which is very damaging to the environment and birds. Can you just take a few minutes and explain to our listeners what's the problem with the Heritage Bill and why?
I suppose there are two main problems with the Heritage Bill. One is the obvious one, and the other one is the not so obvious one. The obvious one is that the Heritage Bill changes the dates for hedge cutting and burning so that you can basically extends the dates for cutting hedges and burning vegetation into the season where birds are nesting. So there's a very clear threat there to our bird populations and our mountain habitats, which are already pretty much ruined. That is the obvious problem. The not so obvious problem, which I really had difficulty with, was how easily the government was able to weaken the few wildlife laws that we have at the behest of the big farming organizations.
Yeah.
Basically, there was public consultation, which was done after the decision was made.
Yeah.
The successive
favorite
ministers,
way of public consultation.
Yeah, allows them to say there was consultation. Most people didn't want it, so they went ahead and did what they wanted to do anyway. There was no engagement with environmental groups throughout the 3 years. The most recent minister refused to meet environmental groups. During the 3 years that it was being debated, there was no scientific information gathered. There was no impact assessment. And what really worried me more than the provisions of the actual legislation was the fact that our nature and our natural heritage could just be thrown in the dustbin like that, at the behest of a big lobby group like that.
Yeah,
which I think is an appalling precedent.
Yeah, and so when we're talking about the habitat destruction and the destruction of the wildlife, you mentioned big farming industry. So are the farmers really the ones to blame? I'm making air quotes here, and I don't want get you into trouble for saying that, but that's we said like commercial fishing is a problem in a sea for the marine wildlife. Is it like farming a problem really? Because I thought that the farmers probably should be again the ones who kind of working together with the conservation organization, because they're on the land, they're living on the land.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We're very careful when we talk about this issue, because we talk about like agriculture is the number one threat to our environment at the moment. And that's not just me saying that. That is reports from the Environmental Protection Agency identified agriculture as the number one cause of pollution.
That's logical, and that's what's all over the world.
There's data behind it. Agriculture is the number one source of greenhouse gas emissions. The National Parks and Wildlife Service in their report say agriculture is the biggest driver of habitat loss and degradation in the country. That's a fact. We don't blame farmers, because we know so many farmers, and many farmers that we speak to are very enthusiastic about nature and they want to do the right thing. But agriculture as it exists today is entirely dependent on state subsidies. In order to get the subsidies, you have to tick the boxes from the Department of Agriculture. If the inspector comes and finds that you have bushes at the back of the field, which may be wonderful wildlife habitat, then you get docked money. You get less payment from the Department of Agriculture. I totally understand that any individual, their household income is going to be your number one priority. That everybody just wants to look after their family, pay their mortgage, all that kind of stuff. So This is what's driving the problem. It's not individual choices made by farmers. They don't get up in the morning and decide, I'm going to hack away at those shrubs at the back of the farm. They are living in fear that the inspector is going to come along and penalise them for something that they haven't done. We have a government programme at the moment that drives intensification of farmland, promoting spraying of chemicals, draining land, removing scrub and habitats, reseeding pastures with the same type of grass. And all of these things are responsible for the collapse in bee populations, the collapse in farmland bird populations. And until we can get that right, until we can address the environmental problems in agricultural policy, we won't see an improvement in the situation. Now, my main difficulty, just to finish the point, is that the big farming lobbies have zero interest in environmental protection. This is not logical, because farming is more than my job or maybe your job. Farming depends entirely on the climate, the soil, the water, the nature. And yet you wouldn't think it by listening to their lobby groups, which persistently and continuously campaign to weaken wildlife laws like the Heritage Bill, to weaken measures to prevent pollution, to make sure that any programs to protect wildlife are diluted to the point where they don't mean anything. This is why farmers get paid to put bird boxes at the back of their garden or back of their farm when none of our endangered birds will lay an egg in a nest box. So we're paying for all of this. The farmers are doing it because they're getting the money for it, and it's doing absolutely no good whatsoever for our extinction crisis.
Jeez. This is a little bit like with the commercial fishermen. They also should, in their interest should be a lot of fish in the ocean. Yet it's that sector that lobbies for more quotas and okay, all the same. Pádraic, thank you very much. It's been really, really amazing and very educational for everybody. So if you all listening to that and want to support wildlife and habitat, Irish Wildlife Trust. Is it like irishwildlifetrust.com or the .org?
It's iwt.ie. You'll also find us on Facebook and Twitter.
Right. So go out there, people, and get involved. Pádraic, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tommy.
And as usual, thank you very much for listening. That was another episode of Tommy's Outdoors Podcast, episode 20. I hope you already subscribed to the podcast. If you didn't, then go ahead and do so. Subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, TuneIn, or whatever you're aggregating your podcast. Also, follow us on Twitter at Outdoors Podcast, and follow us on Instagram at Tommy's Outdoors, and like us on that Facebook at Tommy's Outdoors. So thank you very much, and until the next time, bye bye.